Imagine a power capable of changing the world, eliminating evil with a simple name. What if that power fell into the hands of someone who believes himself to be the divine judge of humanity? Light Yagami didn't seek evil. He sought justice. But what happens when the line between vigilante and tyrant disintegrates, revealing that the monster was hidden behind the brilliance of a self-proclaimed god? Prepare to question your own concepts of good and evil. In the heart of a futuristic Tokyo, where modernity coexists with the persistent challenges of crime, lived Light Yagami. He wasn't just an ordinary student. He was the epitome of academic and athletic perfection, a young man who seemed destined for success. Adored by his peers and praised by every teacher, Light was a prodigy, a brilliant beacon of unquestionable intellect and captivating beauty. His future, undoubtedly, was promising. However, behind this impeccable facade resided a profound existential boredom and a growing aversion to the reality that surrounded him. Light perceived society as a sick organism, infested with criminals who always seemed to escape justice, with politicians drowning in corruption, and with a legal system he considered lamentably ineffective. For him, justice was a chimera, slow, flawed, and incapable of eradicating evil in its entirety. The influence of his father, Soichiro Yagami, a dedicated police chief and a figure of unwavering integrity, only deepened this perception in Light. Through him, Light witnessed firsthand the daily frustration of law enforcement, the helplessness in the face of cunning criminals, and the bureaucracy that frequently hindered the true application of justice. Every news report of an unsolved crime, every story about impunity, further eroded Light's faith in the institution's ability to self-regulate and protect the innocent. He was viscerally convinced that only a radical solution, an intervention of cataclysmic proportions, could purify the world. In his mind, it was like a doctor seeing his patient's body wasting away and concluding that only drastic surgery and amputation could save the rest. The first alarming sign, the initial psychological trait that began to manifest in Light, was his egotism masked by a utopian idealism. His intelligence wasn't just a gift. For him, it was irrefutable proof of his superiority, a divine credential that authorized him to judge and, eventually, to sentence. His vision of an ideal world was not an altruistic dream of peace and harmony, but a personally conceived dystopia, based on the premise that justice was an absolute, non-negotiable concept, and that only he possessed the purity and intellectual capacity to apply it without hesitation or error. Empathy, or any form of consideration for the feelings and suffering of others, was seen as a mere obstacle, an emotional luxury he couldn't afford, replaced by a cold and calculating pragmatism. In his mind, the human cost to individual lives was just an insignificant detail compared to the grandeur and purity of his purpose. He was ready to mold the world in his own image, but he still didn't know how. However, the universe, or perhaps a bored Shinigami, had other plans, and there was something no one, not even the brilliant Light, saw coming. The drastic change in Light's life, the moment of rupture that would seal his destiny and redefine his essence, didn't come from conventional trauma like loss or pain, but from the discovery of an object of unparalleled power, the Death Note. Fallen from the sky, seemingly by mere chance, the notebook seemed to be the cosmic answer to his deepest desires, a tool of divine proportions to realize his vision of a crime-free world. Its appearance marked the true turning point, a watershed between Light the student and Light the god. Initially, skepticism prevailed. Light, a man of logic and reason, tested the notebook with names of criminals reported on television, almost expecting it to be a cruel joke or an elaborate prank. But, as the deaths began to materialize, disbelief gave way to a wave of intoxicating euphoria, followed by an unwavering conviction. He was, in fact, the chosen one. The Death Note wasn't a simple tool. It was the validation of his own grandeur, irrefutable proof that his intelligence and his vision were correct, divinely orchestrated. Light's transformation was swift, brutal, and terrifying. The idealistic student, who merely dreamed of justice, gave way to a being with a fully developed God complex. His purpose, once a latent and secret yearning, solidified into a divine mission, a personal crusade to purify the planet, sweeping away the undesirables from existence. Any lingering internal conflict was quickly subdued and crushed. The voice of morality, if it ever echoed in his mind, was silenced by the overwhelming magnificence of his project. Any doubt about the ethics of his actions was justified by the sheer magnitude of his goal: to eradicate evil, to build a new, peaceful, and perfect world. He didn't see his victims as human beings, but as disposable and necessary elements on the path to utopia. The external conflict, however, came in the enigmatic figure of Al, the world-renowned detective. Al quickly realized that the mass deaths weren't random, but orchestrated by a brilliant mind, nicknaming the killer Kira. Al's relentless pursuit, far from frightening Light, only served to fuel his ego and ambition, pushing him to become more cunning, more cautious, and to reinforce his unwavering belief in his own invincibility. The hunt became a game of cat and mouse, a duel of intellects where Light reveled in every move, convinced of his superiority. Psychology can explain this radical transformation as a classic case of corruption by power, magnified by pre-existing traits of narcissism and a highly gifted intellect. Individuals with these characteristics, when confronted with unlimited power and a lack of moral supervision or counterpoint, can rapidly develop a state of rampant megalomania. The ability to take lives without apparent consequences, and the subsequent justification of such acts as divine justice, reinforces a powerful confirmation bias. Every successful death validates Light's belief in his own righteousness, infallibility, and ultimately, his divinity. He didn't need anyone's approval or validation. The death note was his personal consecration, the altar where his new faith was erected. It was there that the humanity and Light began to crumble, and the abyss between the idealist and the tyrant opened, paving a dark path. Light Yagami's mind did not succumb to the chaos of madness. On the contrary, it molded itself into a cold, almost algorithmic logical structure, an architecture of perfect and methodical annihilation. His actions, his statements, and even his gestures, initially presented as a search for justice, revealed the crystallization of his new way of thinking, that of a sovereign God, the only being capable of discerning good and evil with absolute clarity, without nuance. The declaration, "I will be the God of the new world," was not a pretentious metaphor or a fleeting delusion, but the purest and most literal expression of his newly minted identity. He had ascended, in his own perception, to the pantheon of supreme beings, a role he believed to be his by divine right. Light began to view criminals not as individuals capable of redemption or rehabilitation, but as plagues to be eradicated, viruses threatening the integrity and purity of his new world. His justice was a selective cleansing, a calculated genocide, justified by the promise of a utopian and crime-free future. He delved deeply into the art of manipulation, employing his superior intellect to deceive not only the police and the investigative task force hunting him, but even his formidable and cunning adversary. Al's every move was a meticulous calculation, a premeditated checkmate on a chessboard where the pieces were, coldly, human lives. He sacrificed pawns without hesitation, including innocents who became obstacles to the realization of his kingdom of justice, without an ounce of remorse or guilt, for in his mind they were merely necessary collateral damage. To understand the depth of Light's mental distortion, it is crucial to penetrate his rationalization. He genuinely did not see himself as a murderer. In his mind, he was a cosmic surgeon, excising a malignant tumor from global society. The individual pain of the victims and the suffering of their families were seen as an acceptable and necessary price for the health and purification of the collective. A scientific analogy for this mindset would be eugenics, the distorted ideology of purifying a population through the elimination of individuals deemed undesirable to achieve a superior race or a perfect society. In Light's case, the race was that of virtuous citizens, those who survived under his reign, and the undesirables were all criminals and anyone who dared to oppose his divinely inspired vision. This mindset is a classic example of the dehumanization of the other, a perverse psychological mechanism that allows individuals to justify atrocities by reducing their victims to mere objects, statistics, or subhumans. Light did not see his victims as people with histories, families, hopes, and feelings. He saw them as the personification of evil to be discarded, as undesirable residue to be cleansed from the face of the earth. His contempt for individual human life, seen as a necessary sacrifice, was the fundamental cornerstone of his justice. And although his logic was impeccable in its coldness, the true monster, even darker and crueler, was still dormant within him, waiting for the right moment to fully reveal itself and consolidate its reign of terror. The true act of total transgression for Light, the point of no return from which there was no turning back for humanity or for his own sanity, was not an isolated event, but a gradual and relentless progression of increasingly dark decisions that solidified his identity as Kira. The death of El, his greatest and most astute adversary, marked an absolute watershed. It was not just the elimination of a strategic enemy, but the annihilation of the only mind that truly threatened his reign. With the lull of the way, the illusion that Light could be stopped by any earthly force dissipated, and his megalomania reached unprecedented heights, transforming him from a self-proclaimed vigilante into an indomitable tyrant, a god without opponents to match him. Light's worldview radically and irrecoverably transformed. He no longer saw himself merely as a catalyst for justice, but as justice incarnate, a universal principle in human form, the ultimate arbiter of all that was moral. Traditional morality and ethics, those that govern civilized society and limit power, became irrelevant to him, mere social constructs that did not apply to his divinity. His own principles, forged in his distorted and now omnipotent intellect, dictated what was right and wrong, good or evil. Every death, every manipulation, every deception, every betrayal of those close to him was justified as a necessary step towards the construction of his new world. His rationalization was impeccable, at least in his own mind. Temporary suffering and sacrificed lives were an insignificant price for the peace and order he promised to bring to the world. The end, for Light, absolutely justified all means, no matter how heinous. Light exploited moral dilemmas with a terrifying coldness, almost defiantly, imposing them on the world. The question he implicitly posed to humanity was, what if the only way to eradicate evil is through a greater evil? If tyranny is the only path to utopia? He forced society to confront the idea that divine justice could be brutal, merciless, but paradoxically effective. He became the personification of the Machiavellian maxim that the ends justify the means. Taken to the darkest and most absolute extreme, to a logical conclusion that many fear. He no longer sought absolution or understanding from others. He demanded unquestioning submission to his new world order, for who would dare question a god? For the viewer, a profoundly disturbing dilemma arises. What if he's right? Light's world, though bathed in innocent blood, did indeed record a drastic drop in crime, an undeniable achievement that resonated globally. Would fear and the loss of individual freedoms be a fair price for order and security? The question Light imposed, and which haunts us to this day, is, if evil can be eradicated by a good that demands unimaginable sacrifices, what is the limit of our morality? Would we be able to accept a tyrant if he promised us definitive peace and security? Light had crossed the line of humanity, but the seed of his perverse and seductive logic had been planted in the collective consciousness. From that point on, there was no turning back. What is the boundary between a savior and an executioner? And who, truly, has the right to decide? Light Yagami's mind, despite its terrifying capacity to inflict horror and suffering on a global scale, did not operate in the chaotic vacuum of irrational madness. On the contrary, it represented a disturbing example of instrumental rationality taken to its highest point, culminating in what could be called the logic of destruction. Every action of Light, every name written in the Death Note, made perfect sense within his rigorous and implacable cognitive universe. His actions were not impulsive or emotional. They were meticulously calculated steps in a grand plan of global purification, comparable to the complexity of a mathematical theorem. He acted like a master chess player, always thinking several moves ahead, anticipating his opponent's reactions and adapting his strategy with surgical precision, like an algorithm optimizing its function. A psychological analysis of Light Yagami can point to severe characteristics of a narcissistic personality disorder in its most grandiose stage, or prominent traits that culminate in extreme antisocial behavior. Although he does not demonstrate the impulsivity typical of some antisocial disorders, Light exhibits a remarkable lack of empathy and almost nil capacity to connect with the pain of others. A grandiose sense of self-importance, convinced of his superiority and divine destiny. A capacity for brilliant manipulation, weaving webs of lies and deceptions with mastery. And a total absence of remorse or guilt for his actions. For him, victims are mere objects, obstacles, or disposable tools that serve or hinder his divine goals. This capacity for dehumanization of the other is absolutely crucial for sustaining his logic of destruction, allowing him to commit abominable acts without any moral burden or weight on his conscience. His coldness, his ability to execute crimes with almost robotic precision, and his lack of effect can be compared to studies of organized serial killers who meticulously plan their acts, select their victims based on specific criteria, and operate with a high degree of emotional and situational control. However, Light fundamentally differs in his motivation. He is not driven by sexual impulses, personal sadism, or a desire for immediate gratification, but by a distorted ideology of justice. He is, in essence, an ideological mass murderer, similar to historical figures or cult leaders who justify unspeakable atrocities in the name of a greater vision for humanity. His cause was his own validation, his own self-affirmation as the world's savior. What validated Light's behavior in his own sick mind was the undeniable effectiveness of his actions. The drastic and global drop in crime rates was, for him, irrefutable proof that his justice was working, that his method was the only way. He saw himself as the catalyst of a global phenomenon, a large-scale social experiment where population control through fear and death proved incredibly efficient, like a theorem that proves itself in practice. For Light, it wasn't madness. It was cold calculation, a masterful plan by a superior intellect that was finally correcting the errors of an imperfect and chaotic world. His logic was impeccable, only if we accepted the premise that human life was a disposable resource in the name of a forcibly imposed utopia. What remained after Kira's meteoric rise and swift fall was a world irrevocably divided and marked by the persistent shadow of a pseudo-god. The destruction Light Yagami caused was not just of individual lives, countless and invaluable, but of fundamental ideals that sustained civilized society. He proved brutally and unquestionably that absolute power corrupts absolutely, transforming a brilliant and idealistic young man into a bloodthirsty tyrant, utterly devoid of compassion. The world around him was reshaped by his existence, an indelible trail of fear and change. Crime rates did indeed drop drastically for a time, an undeniable achievement that resonated globally. But this decrease was replaced by a paralyzing fear, widespread distrust among people, and a sense that justice itself could be an invisible and merciless force, faceless, without fair judgment, and with no chance of appeal. The consequences were palpable and profound, even within the fictional universe he inhabited. The investigative task force, international police forces, and even criminal organizations were forced to adapt and question their methods and their very existence in the face of Kira's threat. The figure of Kira, of Light Yagami, transcended the reality of a serial killer, becoming an urban myth, a dark and eternal warning about the dangers of self-justice and vigilantism taken to its most perverse extreme. For some, he was a savior, a herald of a new era of peace and order. For others, a demon, the very embodiment of absolute evil. The heated debate about his morality and legacy continued long after his death, echoing in every corner of the planet, dividing opinions and consciences. The philosophical reflection that emerges from his story is disturbingly profound. Who are we to judge? Light Yagami, by arrogating to himself the role of God, of humanity's final judge, forced society to confront its own inability to deal with evil effectively and justly. He exposed the fragility of legal systems, the slowness of bureaucracy, and the inherent fallibility of human morality. His saga compels us to question whether the end truly justifies the means, and if utopia, however alluring its promise, is worth the price of innocent lives and the suppression of individual freedom. He became living proof that justice without empathy and without limits is merely cruelty in its most efficient form. Kira's legacy is ultimately a cycle of fear and questioning, a scar on the global psyche. His existence demonstrated that power corrupts, yes, but also that the absence of a supreme power capable of curbing evil can lead to despair and the search for extreme solutions, even if they are monstrous. The shadow of the Death Note still looms over the world, and the desire for a perfect world or a distorted version of it continues to haunt humanity. What would be the next step? Who will be the next to find the notebook and succumb to the temptation to become a god, repeating Light Yagami's tragic and bloody errors? The myth of Kira concludes with an air of mystery, an unsettling promise that perhaps he was not the last to believe he could be humanity's final judge.